This video will be part 1 of Chapter 8, covering B.F. Skinner's radical behaviorism for PSY 230 personality theory. Some background on Skinner. He's probably one of the most well-known American psychologists and was hugely influential in kind of the transition of psychology to an empirical science in the United States. When we look at him historically, you have to acknowledge, he was born in the early 1900s in the U.S. His original goal was to be a writer, and he did make some attempts at being a novelist, although he had no success there. So he moved on to studying psychology. He was very, very bright, and he studied psychology at Harvard Graduate School. And this was at a time when there was a shift underway. Early behaviorism coming out of Eastern Europe in the form of Pavlov's work, and also the pioneering work on classical conditioning by Watson. He was kind of following in those footsteps, and there were some early work being done in cognitive psychology, but more so sensation and perception research. So his interests in the science side of psychology were very early in developing. He did do some early biopsychological research at Harvard Medical School, looking at the basics of the nervous system, but he moved on to study the psychology of behavior. He took a faculty position at the University of Minnesota, stayed there through his tenure years, and published his first major work specifying his theoretical principles in the behavior of organisms in 1938. He went back to Harvard eventually, where he stayed until he passed away. He will continue to be very, very active throughout his career. He was part of the leadership in the APA, among other positions known nationally. He was also a bit of a media hound. He and Sigmund Freud had that in common. He liked to speak publicly. He liked to demonstrate principles of learning by bringing out animals and in front of large audiences, demonstrating what he could train them to do. He was a very serious researcher and believed in the science of behaviorism, which is a marked departure from everything we've been studying in this class so far. He was a dogged empiricist. He believed we should only be paying attention to that which we can observe, as you'll see as we go through looking at his theory in detail. So you should, note how different Skinner's approach is to describing human personality from all of the theorists we've looked at so far. And, we're now at the halfway part of the class, so you should think of Skinner's approach here as being a clear departure in many ways from what we've studied so far. Now, we need to get some terminology laid out for ourselves as we embark on studying Skinner's version of behaviorism. The concept of the scientific analysis of behavior is something that will come up frequently in your chapter. It's often described in terms of the ABCs, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. If any of you have, and I'm sure many of you have had this experience, if you've taught a dog or another pet to do any kind of trick or obedience command, you've probably used basic principles of scientific analysis of behavior. So if I'm trying to teach a dog to sit, I use a cue, sit, that's an antecedent. I may pair that with a physical encouragement, such as pressing my hand on their bottom or raising their head, which is a natural shift in weight for the dog to sit. If the dog sits, that's the behavior, and then the consequence would be I give the dog a treat. So many of us have had the experience of using basic behavioral theoretical ideas when we train our pets. The scientific analysis of behavior is based first on the principle that behavior itself can be investigated just like anything else you observe scientifically. For Skinner, the goal was to look at behaviors, think about how behaviors are connected to contingencies. Behaviors always have some kind of connection to both what predicts them and what happens after the behavior is exhibited. Now, primarily, Skinner is talking about here voluntary behaviors, so things that you could choose to do. He's not talking about classically conditioned phenomenon like eye blink reflexes or salivation in dogs, for example, which would be the classic Pavlovian study. He argued that an understanding of behavior means that you do, and Skinner used rats, he used pigeons mostly, but with any organism, including humans, you have to think about what their evolutionary history has made it possible and most likely for that organism to learn. So you really have to think, what is it that birds, like pigeons, he was very fond of pigeons, and used them quite a lot in his research. They have a tendency to peck. They have a tendency to move around their world in a very specific way. Pigeons, get their food off the ground, or they get it from fairly low surfaces. They're observant. They notice predictors in their world that make it more likely that food is going to be in the offing. So he argued that anytime you're trying to understand behaviors that can be trained by manipulating consequences, you need to go into that understanding what it is that that particular organism is most likely to do. For example, there's a classic paper that was published by a researcher in tandem with some animal trainers who worked in the marketing industry to train animals to do tricks that would be used in television commercials. And they note the particular difficulties of working with, for example, raccoons who love to wash their food in water. So they have this sort of ingrained, almost reflexive tendency to pick up a piece of food and dip it in even if it's in imagined water, and then pick it back up. So there was this one advertisement where they wanted the raccoon to pick up a coin, a big fake coin, and deposit it in a bank, a piggy bank. The problem was that the raccoon would pick up the coin very successfully, easy to train behavior. They're very handy. They pick up stuff all the time. So that part was easy. Getting the animal to take it to the bank was easy. Even getting it to put the coin in the slot was easy. The problem was the raccoon wouldn't let go. It just kept dipping the coin in the slot. So, they had to really change the advertisement because they couldn't get the animal to cooperate. Excuse me. So the scientific analysis of behavior, where you start, after you've kind of understood what's the evolutionary background of the species that you're working to train, you begin by taking apart the behavior and analyzing what were the antecedents, what were the consequences. Is the behavior something you want to change? Is it something you want to make more common, or is it something you want to reduce in frequency? And that's the real analysis that you're engaging in. So to give you a concrete example, and I always like cartoons, there's tons of cartoons about behaviorism out there. So you've got antecedent. The couple is sitting on the couch enjoying their television evening. Their dog, Boogie, in this case, sits in front of the husband and stares. And then what's the consequence of the staring behavior? The people, the humans, move over and the dog gets to join them on the couch. So if that's what happens, so the dog exhibits the staring behavior, the human moves over and gives the dog what it wants, which is a reward of being allowed on the couch with the humans. Another example, people sitting at the table, dog sits and provides starving dog face, that's the behavior. And then if the people give the dog a reward, that's the consequence. So what you see here in both these examples is that by giving the dog a treat, you're increasing the frequency or duration or the intensity of the behavior that preceded that reinforcer. So the consequence is reinforcing the behavior of sitting and looking like you're starving if you're this particular dog. So to review and give you a more specific definition of the scientific analysis of behavior, you start with a behavior that can be fully described. And by fully described, what's meant is that you can see it, you can see the behavior, you're not imagining something, you're not making inferences. So Skinner was adamant, you only go with what you can see and actively measure. So you can see the dog sit and look starving. If you're training a dog just to sit, you can see that it's either sitting or it's not sitting, or it's partially sitting. You can observe that and you can measure it. You can also observe and measure how quickly the behavior is being exhibited. Things you can't measure, thoughts, motivations. You also can't measure other kinds of emotional variables. Skinner, while he didn't deny that those things happen, he felt that they were inappropriate for scientific study because you can't observe and measure them. Self, if you're defining self in terms of a scientific analysis of behavior, should be based on what you can see. So if we're talking about human beings, personality then is defined as the sum total of your learning history, which produces a reliable pattern of behaviors that are observable, that can be seen, and that can be recorded, that can be measured. Not on all those internal things like the unconscious or motivation or drive. So Skinner was openly dismissive of the psychoanalytic theory. He was also openly dismissive of humanistic theory, which we haven't studied in this class yet, but it would be people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow. We openly, these are non-scientific approaches. They're more like religion than they are fact. So his theory was based strictly on what you can see. So the self is defined by your particular pattern of learned behaviors. What he suggests was this really takes off the table in personality theorizing. It completely takes off the table having to understand anything about inner motivations, repositories of drives, repositories of memories. All it requires is that you watch behavior, that you record and measure that behavior, and then you can predict the next behavior. So basically, as I said before, personality is essentially a collection of behavior patterns. And when you collect enough of those patterns, you can essentially effectively explain, because you're going to explain it in ABC terms, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. You can eventually predict how behavior is going to unfold in the future if you have that information and you've been comprehensive enough in collecting the data. Now your authors make an interesting comparison. When we get to the point in the semester, way toward the end of the term, and we actually look at Zen Buddhism, you will notice one kind of thematic commonality between radical behaviorism and Buddhist teachings. And that's the idea that there's no kind of observable individual self that's independent from, that's objectively real. And for Skinner, he didn't believe there was any kind of individual, internal, inborn self. He believed more that that was something that we construct for ourselves, that we use our very powerful minds to create kind of a fictional belief system that endows us with free will, that endows us with self-control, that endows us with things like motivation and emotion. But he believes that ultimately other things are more explanatorily useful for us. So in Buddhism, what we'll discover when we study that chapter, there's no real valuing of this concept of individual personality. There is this acceptance of the idea that there are behaviors, there's sensations, there are perceptions, there are emotions, there are motivations, but none of them are permanent. They don't stick. And, Skinner would essentially agree with that there are feelings, that there are perceptions, there are sensations. They come and they go. What remains is what is done, behaviors. So Skinner and the Buddhists, they start with the assumption of an absence of ego or self, and move instead to saying there's a collection of what is done. There's a collection of what you see, of acts, of behaviors. And when we study Buddhism, you'll notice that there's this recipe for how to live a well-lived life. It's very behavioral in orientation. You do these things. You don't do these things. It's in some ways fairly prescriptive. And if you engage in those behaviors, you're living a well-lived life. For Skinner, without sort of the Zen Buddhist trappings and kind of philosophical assumptions attached, Skinner is not deviating all that far from that. If you want to live a well-lived life, you set up a set of contingencies that are going to support behaviors that are adaptive and constructive to living a well-lived life. If you are exhibiting behaviors that are inappropriate or that aren't adaptive, then you set up contingencies to reduce those behaviors. So both of these theories are going to make the argument that understanding what causes behavior helps us to understand ourselves more fully. So to pull some of these ideas together, we need to bring in the concept of what's called an explanatory fiction. As I said before, and I apologize for my voice, I'm having a bit of an allergy reaction, but I'll be fine. So explanatory fictions. I mentioned before that Skinner talked about the idea that we, as in Buddhism, we construct this artificial sense of reality, of our own importance, of our own motivations, of our own emotions, of our own internal kind of workings, and feel that they are real. And this is similar to the sense of ego in Buddhism. So for Skinner, he called these explanatory fictions. He argued that we create these hypothetical constructs, these unobserved things like a motive, an emotion, even an internal drive, for example. They're assumed to be there and they're assumed to be important. So, for example, in Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow's theories, there's an assumption that you have inborn, kind of personalized, inherent potentials, things that you have to work in your life to discover and bring to the surface. Skinner thought that was ridiculous. He didn't believe that anyone was born uniquely special. We're born pretty much blank, and our uniqueness comes from our unique learning histories. He felt that it was faulty logic to believe in these inherent potentials. So he called this the use of circular reasoning, where you're thinking, okay, why am I the way I am? Because I was supposed to be. That's circular reasoning. And that was one of his major criticisms of humanistic psychology, was this circular nature of saying, well, how do you know inherent potentials exist? Because I have grown to be the person that I am. Well, for Skinner, that is an utterly unscientific and illogical approach. It leads to an explanatory fiction, such as the belief in inherent potentials. So when we get into Rogers and Maslow in a little bit here in our class, you'll see what I mean. It's flawed by this belief in explanatory fiction, according to Skinner. And he had a number of very public back and forths with Carl Rogers, arguing about these principles and the nature of what Skinner called an explanatory fiction. That he argued were basically designed to make us feel in control, to make us feel better about ourselves. So what are these explanatory fictions that Skinner articulated? First, he believed that we, as humans, we've constructed an explanatory fiction in the form of perceiving ourselves as free, as having freedom. So when we are unaware of what's actually causing our behavior, like think about the clothing that you choose. You feel free to choose things that fit your style, but why did you actually choose them? And what tends to happen is that we, in our own minds, we believe in our own freedom, but we are unaware of what the actual causes of our behavior are. And that's consistent with what he called the belief in the autonomous person or autonomous man. And for many, particularly in Western culture, we tend to believe there is a self that is underneath, that is living in us, not a separate one, not somebody different from us, but we believe we have a private self that is capable of making its own decisions and being motivated to act independently of reinforcers or punishers that surround us. Skinner thought that that was fictitious, that we're just kidding ourselves, that we're capable of fully autonomous behavior. He also used the concept of dignity as connected to getting praise or being given credit for behaviors. When we believe in this construct of dignity, Skinner believed we like that idea because we feel like it is something that has extra added value beyond just the regular contingencies that are associated with it. So if we lose kind of access to or knowledge of the actual contingencies driving our behavior, we may ascribe to them an explanation in the form of dignity. He also believed that there was an explanatory fiction in the form of perceiving ourselves as highly creative. He believed that creative behavior is in no way different from any other behavior we might exhibit. It's a habitual behavior that he believes has antecedents and consequences. So essentially, when you are highly creative, it is because you have been rewarded for doing so. He assumes, if you combine many of these explanatory fictions together, Skinner assumes that we do not have free will. So from a philosophical standpoint, he believes that no behavior is independent of its antecedents and contingencies. All behavior has explanations that are grounded in external reactions to those behaviors. And then finally, the self. And I have, as a student of personality theory, I struggle to separate out the difference between his explanatory fiction of the self and the autonomous person or autonomous man. I believe that the difference is this very steadfast belief in the independent self, and it's having an articulated structure. So the autonomous man is more about motivation. The self is more about structure and how people have been kind of trained to believe that they are unique, that they are special. Again, this was an argument that he had with Carl Rogers very publicly. And that concludes part 1 of Skinner's radical behaviorism.